First of all, I just want to say thank you everybody for joining us here. This is the second talk in our open house series that we're doing. Obviously, with everything that's been happening with coronavirus, a lot of events and conferences had to be canceled. We just wanted to create a space where people could still interact with each other, have some of the conversations we might have had at those conferences but aren't able to, which is what led us to create the virtual open house. We kicked off the open house with a keynote from Ascent CEO Brian Clark about ethical AI yesterday. And today we have the second session with Maria Phillips about the evolution of regulation. So Maria, I want to jump in by first off talking about how up until about a month ago, the most recent watershed moment in financial history was obviously the global financial crisis. You know, that reshaped basically all aspects of financial life, including, of course, regulatory compliance. Can you start by just giving us a little bit of information about your background, and then talking about how in that background you witnessed a regulation change from before to after the global financial crisis?
Sure. So my background is in compliance, risk, and also accounting is where I started. So when the GFCs happened last time, I was working for KPMG. So we had a big, it was quite the shock. That was about a decade ago, unfortunately. So yes, there's been a massive change. So I suppose from accounting terms, you know, we have seen the rise of SOX. And obviously the various different accounting boards, you know, the various different financial and different types of reporting that would have now be, I suppose, evolved within banking. I think, yeah, like I suppose my background again is across the three, you know, accounting, risk, and compliance, but the various different sectors I've worked in were, you know, aviation, pharma, banking, insurance. But they've all been impacted by the GFC, and they all had various different regulations, which I suppose you would have seen impact the person sitting in that second line of defense.
Yeah, absolutely. And then can you just also just talk a little bit about, so obviously we talk about how, you know, the regulatory environment has increased dramatically in the last handful of years, partially as a response to the global financial crisis. Can you just talk about that change, how that's impacted, obviously risk compliance teams, but also regulators?
Yeah, so I think the day-to-day kind of accounting risk or compliance person has had to broaden, I suppose, what they have historically been looking at. So if you think about, you know, again, the introduction of various different regulations. So each time a new big regulation comes out, you have to become knowledgeable in that area if it's relevant to your entity. So even thinking of MiFIR, you know, the regulation, which then went on to MiFID, the directive, MiFID II, you're talking about a person sitting in a seat who's not only got to sort of do their day-to-day job, they have this regulator or regulators which are launching huge amounts of regulations or directives into the market and laws that are relevant. So the constant sort of drive to become and sustain and maintain and continually grow in your knowledge of what the type of products you're doing, so like essentially what you're selling within the entity, but also how that's governed or how that's regulated from a regulator point of view. Because you are held to account sitting in the second line, you're massively held to account sitting there because you're wedged between internal audit, who are, you know, ensuring that you have the knowledge and doing assurance on your work, but you know, you have the first line or the guys who are essentially in front office or you know, dealing day to day with the customer, who are referring up to you for a point of view or guidance on what exactly they should or shouldn't be doing sometimes. So it's quite a change, and even the evolution of the second line, as you know, I don't think I knew what the third line of defense was when I really started in banking. That was way back in UBS. Like I knew about internal audit. I never would have called that third line of defense. So it's that whole change in your knowledge and kind of your conduct within your line of defense and the knowledge of who's above you and who's, you know, not below you, but, you know, in front of you, essentially, within the three lines.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you also, you know, talk a little bit more about, so obviously we talked about the global financial crisis. You alluded to the waves of regulation that have happened over the last couple of years, but just over the last, you know, decade or so, this long bull market that we've had, what other trends have sort of popped up during that time? I know you touched on GDPR. I'm thinking of other things like, you know, the rise in prevalence of the 3 lines of defense, that kind of concept. You could just talk about some of those trends.
Yeah, so I mean, the 3 lines of defense and the whole idea of compliance and that. If I think back to the GFC when I was working, I don't think I really ever heard the terms 3 lines of defense. So yes, the whole division and kind of assurance on assurance on assurance, that whole model obviously has sort of not necessarily risen out of it, but it's come to the fore. You know, when you talk in banking terms about 3 lines of defense, most people that sit in any part of the bank or the insurance entity will understand what you mean. They'll know where they sit. There's been obviously a massive change in that. It's just the what do they call it? The conduct culture and that sort of understanding of where you sit and where you who it goes up to, who, when you send this report, somebody else aside from your manager will be looking at it, and sort of understanding kind of where you sit in that chain. And I suppose people are competing in, well, banks and financial entities are competing in a globalized market. So you're not just looking at kind of compliance officers who need to keep an eye on their local jurisdiction. They have to be able to have the capacity and have the ability, have the skill set to look at other areas of compliance or other jurisdictions of compliance. For example, you know, if you're an entity working out of the UK and they also have a Euro playing entity in Ireland or France, then they might have some processes happening out in New York. You know, you have to be able to, I suppose, understand the regulators expecting you, will have the expectation that they can go on site in any one of those places and audit you or to create some sort of ability to have oversight on what you're doing. That wasn't there before. Certainly, I never felt the presence of it, certainly not a decade ago, but it is something people are very conscious of. If you're sitting in that compliance seat, if you're sitting in that risk seat, they're very, very aware that, I suppose, their impact and how they play in that global kind of scale now, rather than it used to be that isolated kind of, I only have to look at my regulator kind of point of view.
Yeah, that globalization trend, I mean, that's just increased the pressure, the work for risk compliance teams, right? Because now they're not just abiding by the regulator of the country, they're regulators of the country they're based in, but wherever they're transacting business.
Hugely so. And not just like, okay, am I compliant here? Am I compliant there? It now, you know, it also breaches into the policies and into the procedures. So it's not just, do I understand and can I answer the regulator's question here and here? It's, do my policies and procedures reflect maybe the main legal entity, but also those localizations that you have in each country? And it can be quite complex to try and get, you know, a credit risk policy to comply with 4 different jurisdictions. You might have anomalies that happen in each separate jurisdiction that the regulator is really holding on to and really wants to see. And sometimes they can contradict each other. Well, not necessarily contradict each other. They can overlap and point you in different directions. And it can be very hard to make a call on that. For the person sitting in that seat, and also anyone that, you know, if they refer it up to legal or if they refer it to an external expert to look at and review and make a call for them, it all comes back on the compliance officer and the chief compliance officer at the end of the day.
Yeah, and then it kind of forces companies to just abide by the strictest regulation too, right? I mean, I'm thinking even like CCPA versus GDPR,
Yeah.
or, you know, the privacy regulation that's coming out in the US. It's not nearly as, cohesive, as complex as GDPR is. So if a business is also transacting in Europe, they're sort of forced to abide by GDPR because it's just too complicated to try and play both sides of that. Yes,
and if you think in that example, you know, you might have to comply with GDPR, but it's not from your regulator. Now, obviously, it's from GDPS, which is a European-wide regulator, so it's not even from a local, say, UK or regulator here. So you now have to reach out of your jurisdiction and try to become knowledgeable in an area that has nothing to do with, anything to do with necessarily to do with your jurisdiction. And that's really hard, because you have, working groups, and you'll have various different panels that you can go and look at and chat to, and you can have information days from your various different compliance associations or risk associations, and that's what you have to use if you're trying to gather this information. So in that scenario, you're really left, trying to dial into something and getting an understanding, and or trying to find somebody locally who is, a legal expert or some sort of an expert that can guide you in relation to this. It can be really tough to sit in that seat.
Yeah, I absolutely, I would think so. I want to ask you a little more about that and sort of the trends you see in the future. But before we go there, let's just talk a little bit about obviously the current crisis that we're in, which is, evolving day by day. But it certainly seems to be substantial. We obviously don't know yet how regulators are going to respond. But just looking for, sort of your opinion, your take on, what you think could be sort of come out of something like this.
Yeah, well, I think the impact as is right now, I mean, I'm hearing from former colleagues of mine that, they're really scrutinizing everything they do right now, because, they can't charge the fees right now for this quarter. They're sending them back, or they're not charging them because they can't be seen to capitalize on this. So you're looking at a business process and the compliance piece within it, and are we in or out of compliance if we do this or that, and kind of how we would be judged by the market. And compliance is playing a massive part of that evaluation right now. So the initial impact right now is, they're trying to essentially make sure that whatever they're doing, it's within the realms of what they're allowed to do. But I think the long-term piece, I mean, how can you business continuity processes, your BCP planning, for a pandemic? Were we ever really planning for that? Did we ever really have hot sites? You can't have a hot site for a pandemic. It's exactly the opposite. I think a trend that will happen is that, we'll all now realize that we probably could have had that as a phone call rather than a face-to-face meeting. And, video conferencing is probably the way forward. And another way that potentially banks could, help cut their costs would be to have video conferencing and working from home, rather than having everyone sitting at a seat in a desk. That costs an awful lot of money for the bank, right? So that could be a short-term sort of, solution for them, and probably good for the people that work for them. But I think long-term, I suppose if you look back to things like regulators are forcing banks and FS to look at the impact of environmental changes. Okay, so will they further expand that out and say, well, it's not just your environment in the context of flooding and drought. Well, actually now you have to have a pandemic modeling in there as well. So I think there's a very strong possibility they'll do that. I mean, okay, it's my personal opinion. You had SARS, Ebola, MERS, before, that never really kind of crossed borders to this extent. And obviously this is the first one that has. So, I mean, I think it would be pretty sure on that they're going to model or force the banks to model something into to kind of overview this, or to kind of capture what the impact might be for them, but also their business model as well. Because remember, they're not just regulated in what they're doing, they're regulated on their business model, usually on an annual, depending on how big the entity is as well. Okay.
Definitely. It's interesting, like we talked about globalization for businesses, but obviously that's also the general globalization trend is also leading to things like global pandemics becoming possible, just how much we're interacting as a global society at this point. Okay, so let's just move to sort of, near-term future, short-term future. What are the other trends you see for the evolution of regulation? I think obviously technology, you've talked about some. I think that's going to be a big one. If you just sort of expand on that a little.
I think for 2020, what I'm looking at is I think the regulators themselves are going to realize that, yes, they want the entity to be compliant, but I think they're going to have to do something to encourage technology to be onboarded to help with this. I think it's natural that you look at that cost center, the second line of defense cost center, and say, well, how can that be tackled? And there's a responsibility on the regulator, I feel, that they have to be part of that, and they have to obviously, make sure that they're regulated to the point where the entity has to review the vendor. But I think there has to be a push for technology to play a massive part in the next decade and how we evolve within this sector, because there's no other way that they can not even cut the costs, keep the costs as they are going forward. It's just a constant wave. So I think technology has to play a part in the next decade and how we evolve, and how my former colleagues, they'll certainly welcome anything that will make their life easier. But the regulator, again, just has to play a part in sort of bringing that to the fore and allowing that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, just as like, we always talk about how technology is so essential, as you mentioned, for risk and compliance take on this massive workload, but for regulators, they're faced with a very similar problem, and they also need technology, sub-tech, and those sorts of solutions to be able to solve their problems too.
Yes, definitely. And you're seeing that, like, they are trying, like there's an awful lot of initiatives, and you're seeing certain regulators, I won't call them out by name, but they certainly are moving forward and trying to sort of lead the way in, like, because again, they work in silos, right? They're not necessarily meant to be working together, but they are attempting to kind of reach out and look at best practices, and how do they move forward, and how do they create a change in their own market. So you're seeing some change. It's slow, but hopefully now that will progress and get an awful lot better in the next, as I said, decade.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. I'm going to just open it up here, see if there's anyone that has any questions. At the same time, I'm going to share our link for our open house page in the chat, and just also preview a few more talks that are coming up in the next couple of days here. On Thursday, April 2nd, we've got the shortest commute ever, setting up a remote workforce. I'm really excited about that one. We've got a couple different people on our team that are going to be talking about that. Then on Friday, we're going to be talking to Craig Novak, one of our account executives, about how to make digital transformation work for you. And then we've got a few more the next week as well, including an exciting one about creating data certainty in uncertain times with our VP of Data Science. That said, if there's any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, your hand. I'll give you just another minute here to see, and otherwise we can wrap up. All right, great. Well, Maria, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, to walk us through this, working out the time zone difference between you and me. I really appreciate it. And I just thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you. Take care, Marcus.
Right. Absolutely, you too. Thanks, everyone. Bye.